Hello and welcome guys to another track guide and Hotlap. Today we've got week 6 of the GT3 Sprint Series, so let's have a look at the Hotlap and then we'll have a look at the guide. So now that we've seen the lap, let's have a look at the guide. So for the first corner, we're looking over to the left hand side and there's a few white lines across the track. And we're looking to brake between this line for the 150 meter marker and this one for the 100 meter board. So about halfway between those two markers, we're braking down into fourth gear and we're turning in just before we get to this 50 meter line. So just before we get to that 50 meter board, we're turning in, now into third gear, and we're apexing around about the middle of this right-hander, trailing off the brakes and then getting back onto the power as we reach that curb. Full throttle and let it drift out to the left here. Be careful for track limits, but you can go 2 wheels over the white line, just don't cross the edge of this red and white curbing. So we can go really wide here, and then we turn in again for this part of the right-hander, basically just before this curb gets smaller. So as you see, it's quite wide here, then it gets a bit thinner at this point. So just before this change, we want to turn in full throttle and just carry as much speed as possible through this right-hander, apexing basically just at this yellow sausage curb on the inside. And then try and straighten the wheel as early as possible. And for our braking reference, we're braking about halfway between this line and this line. About halfway between those two lines, we want to get onto the brakes. Down into second gear initially, and we're turning in just before this curb ends on the left hand side. Now into first gear, and we're apexing just at the end of this yellow sausage curb because we want to be on the right hand side coming out of this corner. So we don't want to be over here, we want to be here. So as you see, we get onto the power now, and that is going to straighten up and we're on the right side of the track. And then we turn in before this grass ends on the right hand side, and then it's full throttle depending on the track conditions. In this track condition, as you see, Luciano lifts to just 90% and then immediately back to 100%. But on some track conditions, you'll be able to take that 100%. Just depends on how much grip is available for the track. So now the downhill hairpin. Now, on the right hand side, there isn't as many markers as there is on the other corners. So what we can use as a reference is as this green tarmac ends, just before that ends, we want to get on the brakes. So here, Luciano's on the brakes and it ends there. You'll notice it's sort of a triangle shape as it ends. So just before that ends, we want to get onto the brakes. Down into second gear, very late turn in for this hairpin because we've got an uphill after it. So we want to get on the power nice and early and straighten up the wheel. Down into first gear, just before the apex. Get on the power nice and early and unwind the steering wheel so that we get that power down to get up the hill. Now for this double right-hander coming up, we want to look at this 50 meter board, and there's a white line along the track for this 50 meter board, and we want to turn in around about that point. So at that point we want to turn in. About 10% braking down into third gear at the apex and just lift off the throttle just to carry some momentum and keep the car stable. We can use a little bit of throttle just after the curb and then a little bit more braking. As you see, we're basically just trying to place the car on this left curbing here. And then just after we cross this white line, we want to increase the braking pressure to actually slow it down for this hairpin. And we turn in just before this grey strip of tarmac or green strip of tarmac ends. In second gear, get on the power nice and early. As you see, just as we get to that yellow sausage curve, getting onto the power, because again we're going uphill, so we want to be on that power early. Unwind the steering wheel as early as possible. And now we just have a nice little straight here. This left-hander, basically turn in just after this white line on the right hand side. Just after that, we want to turn in full throttle corner and just carry as much speed as possible through this left-hander. Now bring it over to the left on the exit of that left-hander. Make sure you're bringing it over to the left here. And then we turn in for this right-hander at this white line. So this is the 100-meter white line. We turn in there, fifth gear, and then we get onto the brakes just after that turning point, down into fourth gear, and we're basically aiming to just go as wide as possible for this right-hander. It's a bit of a weird entry, but you just want to try and keep the steering wheel as straight as possible initially. Down into second gear, and there isn't really a good turn-in reference here, but we're aiming for this yellow sausage curve as the apex, so whichever turn-in point you can use to get this turn-in, and we want to apex just as that yellow sausage curve ends. Get on the power just before we get to that curb, unwind the steering wheel, and then for this left-hander, bring it over to this darker patch of tarmac, full throttle for this left-hander, up into fourth gear, and then allow the car to drift out over to the right to open up this coming left-hander. And we're braking before we get to this white line. There isn't really a reference for the actual braking marker, so just use that white line about 2 or 3 car lengths before that white line. Down into second gear, and again a really late apex. There is a yellow sausage curb on the apex here, and that's where we want to be apexing the corner. Getting on the power just after we pass that yellow sausage curb, unwind the steering wheel again, and then bring it back over to the left hand side to open up this right hander. And we're turning in just before this grass ends, and then we're getting onto the brakes as you see here, down into second gear. And we're basically aiming to get a really late apex here. As you see, there isn't a marker on the apex, but just get as late an apex as possible. Gently get onto the power because there's a lot of load transfer with it being downhill and turning. So just try and be careful with your power application. And now for the final corner, we're turning in just as the curb ends here on the left hand side. So just as that red and white curb ends, we want to be turning in for the right hander. Depending on the track conditions, you will or will not have to lift. As you see, Luciano lifts to about 40%, then up to 100% again. So it just depends on how much grip you have. Sometimes you'll be able to take that flat, sometimes you'll need to lift just to feel how much grip you've got. But the main point of the last corner is just to use as much of the track available to you as possible without invalidating the lap. But that is it for the Hotlap and track guide, guys. As always, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and see you again next time.